19th September 1944. Fort Montbarry, Brittany, France. A German garrison is sheltering inside an 18th century fort with walls 4 meters thick, a 40-foot earth embankment and a moat 15 feet deep. Elite Fallschirmjäger, some of the finest soldiers the Third Reich could field. They had been preparing this position for weeks. They had wire, mines, interlocking fields of fire, and concrete strong enough to laugh at conventional artillery. They did not surrender to infantry. They did not surrender to artillery. They surrendered after 3 Churchill Crocodiles pulled up to the moat and began pumping burning liquid across it. The entire action took less than an hour. To understand why the Crocodile existed, you need to understand what Dieppe proved. In August 1942, Canadian and British forces launched a raid on the French Channel port. It was a catastrophe. Over 3,600 Canadians were killed, wounded or captured in a single morning. Among the failures, a critical one stood out. Engineers tasked with destroying beach obstacles and building ramps for the tanks were cut down in the open before they could do anything. The tanks that did get ashore were stopped cold by seawalls, ditches, and fortifications that nobody had properly planned to overcome. The lesson was brutal and clear. Before infantry could fight through a defended coastline, something had to go ahead of them to break it open. Something armoured. Something that could do what engineers did, but survive doing it. The man given the task of solving this problem was Major General Percy Hobart. He had been retired, quietly sidelined by an army establishment that found his ideas too unconventional. Winston Churchill personally intervened to bring him back. Hobart assembled a collection of specialised armoured vehicles so bizarre in appearance that they quickly acquired a nickname: Hobart's Funnies. There were tanks with giant flailing chains on rotating drums to detonate mines, tanks carrying portable bridges on their hulls, amphibious tanks with flotation screens, tanks towing canvas carpet layers for soft beach sand. And then there was the Crocodile, the most feared of all of them, the one the Germans surrendered to before it had even fired. The Crocodile was built on the Churchill Mark VII infantry tank, chosen for 2 reasons. First, its armour, up to 152mm thick at the front, proof against almost everything short of a dedicated anti-tank gun at close range. Second, its interior volume and multiple escape hatches, which gave engineers enough room to fit the conversion equipment and gave crews a realistic chance of getting out if things went wrong. The conversion kit was elegantly simple. The hull-mounted Besser machine gun was removed and replaced with a flame projector nozzle. An armoured pipe ran from this nozzle back through the hull floor to a coupling at the rear of the tank, known as the link, a 3-jointed articulated connection that could flex up, down, left, right, and pivot horizontally. Attached to the link was the trailer. That 6.5-ton armoured box on 2 wheels was the entire point. It carried 400 imperial gallons of fuel and 5 cylinders of compressed nitrogen gas propellant, enough for 80 one-second bursts. The fuel was not ordinary petrol. It was a thickened incendiary mixture, heavy, sticky, designed to cling to surfaces rather than splash and dissipate. It burned on water and could be used to set fire to woods and houses. The effective range was around 80 yards in normal conditions, up to 120 under favourable wind. The projector threw the fuel at 4 imperial gallons per second. If you have never seen a flamethrower tank fire, that rate of delivery produces something that looks less like a weapon and more like a natural disaster arriving horizontally. Critically, the turret-mounted 75mm gun was retained. Unlike standard flame tanks of the era, the Crocodile could serve as both a conventional tank and a terrifying close assault weapon. This mattered enormously in practice. A vehicle that carried only a flamethrower was a specialist that enemy gunners could prioritise and pick off before it got close enough to fire. A vehicle that also had a tank gun was something that had to be engaged on its own terms. The trailer, meanwhile, could be jettisoned from inside the tank if it was hit or once empty, freeing the Crocodile to operate as a standard gun tank for the rest of the action. Before we get into where the Crocodile fought and what it achieved, if you're enjoying this series on British military engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing. The Churchill Crocodile first saw action on D-Day, June 6, 1944, when 13 and 15 troops of C Squadron, 141st Regiment Royal Armoured Corps, landed at La Rivière and Le Hamel, respectively. The beach landings were chaotic. None of 15 troops' tanks made it off the sand until the following morning. But on the 7th of June, 13 troops used their flame projectors for the first time against German defensive positions. The result reportedly prompted the surrender of 150 enemy troops under a white flag. One day into the campaign, first use of the weapon, 150 men walked out with their hands up rather than face what they had just seen. The psychological dimension was the Crocodile's defining characteristic and its most dangerous liability simultaneously. The flame projector was considered such a powerful psychological weapon, so feared by the Germans, that captured Crocodile crews were often summarily executed. These men knew what they were getting into. They climbed into their tanks, attached a trailer full of burning fuel to the back, drove toward defended positions, and did it anyway. Aspects of the mechanism were considered so secret that disabled units, if they could not be recovered, were rapidly destroyed by any means, including airstrike if necessary. The British were determined that the Germans would not reverse engineer it, a concern that would prove prophetic given what the Italians had done with the Dingo in the desert. In practice, the Crocodile rarely needed to actually fire to achieve its objective. The standard tactic developed through the Normandy campaign was to pair Crocodiles with Churchill AVREs, the armoured engineer tanks carrying the petard spigot mortar, the so-called flying dustbin, capable of blowing concrete to rubble at close range. The AVRE would crack the fortification open. The Crocodile would pull forward and let the defender inside decide whether they wanted to experience what came next. On several occasions, Crocodiles would engage in a show of force just outside an occupied village, while British infantry moved toward it alongside them. The Germans invariably chose to walk out. At Brest in September 1944, Crocodiles supported American forces assaulting one of the most heavily fortified port cities in occupied France. The 141st RAC worked alongside US infantry through a complex of bunkers, tunnels, and reinforced positions that had resisted weeks of conventional attack. Fort Montbarry, the centerpiece of the defense, fell in under an hour once the Crocodiles reached the moat. The fort that had been designed to stop armies was undone by 3 tanks and a trailer full of burning fuel. The Americans, who had largely declined the offer of Hobart's funnies before D-Day, a decision General Bradley would spend some time regretting afterward, requested Crocodile support repeatedly through the autumn of 1944. Of the 800 conversion kits produced, 250 were held in reserve for possible operations against the Japanese. Those operations never came. Japan surrendered in August 1945. But the Crocodile did not disappear from British service. The Churchill Crocodile saw action during the Korean War in the early 1950s. By that point, it was operating alongside vehicles half a generation newer, in terrain utterly unlike the bocage it had been designed for, and it was still effective enough to be worth keeping in the field. The Crocodile's post-war legacy, however, is best understood not through the vehicle itself, but through what it proved. The Royal Engineers subsequently used modified Centurion and Chieftain tanks designed to fulfill the same roles in battle as the Funnies. The Centurion AVRE, the Chieftain AVRE, and ultimately the Titan and Trojan variants of the Challenger II all trace their conceptual lineage directly back to what Hobart assembled for D-Day. The idea that a modern armoured force needs dedicated engineer vehicles working alongside gun tanks, vehicles built for breaching, not fighting, is now fundamental doctrine across every major NATO army. The British Army arrived at that conclusion in 1943, under pressure, 6 weeks before the most complex amphibious assault in history. The rest of the world spent the following decades catching up. Only 800 Crocodile kits were ever built. It fought on one front for 1 year, then continued in service for less than a decade before being retired. It was not produced in great numbers. It did not serve in a dozen countries. It was not the kind of vehicle that earns its reputation through longevity or ubiquity. It earned its reputation by doing something that nothing else could do, that nothing else had even properly tried to do before. It drove up to the most heavily fortified positions on the Western Front and made the men inside them choose between fire and surrender. Most of them chose surrender. That is not brutality. That is engineering saving lives on both sides of the wire.